Today, this video is brought to you by you all. Yeah, you guys, over on Patreon and the Epoch Philosophy website. The subject matter here isn't looking good for advertisers, as a prospective planned advertiser asked for the topic of this video and noped out when I told them. Fun times. But even with some in-video sponsors, I'm only able to keep making these videos because of the people that kindly pledge over on Patreon and the Epoch Philosophy website. If this video brings some value to you, consider signing up for as little as a single coffee a month. I have some exclusive content, podcasts, ability to vote on videos, and general community updates. Oh, and at epochphilosophy.com, I offer some discounts on merchandise. Anyhow, this YouTube thing can be pretty difficult, particularly financially, so every bit over on Patreon and our website helps immensely. Now, let's get into the video. There's a chance that if you clicked on this video, you dislike your job. While an anecdote on our own collective work experience may suffice, I'm not just pulling this statement out of nowhere. A joint analysis from Gallup, Lumina Foundation, and a few others found that just under half of workers like their job. Another study under Pew Research found that only 51% of workers held a favorable view of their job. This is across all sectors, no matter if you work in HR, construction, engineering, what have you. This phenomenon of hating your job is pretty universal. Yet, the context does vary. As far as reported worker dissatisfaction goes, personally, I suspect the real number is much higher, particularly around the use of language in surveys. I'm sure many of you have noticed that when someone is asked if they enjoy their job and they reply yes, so very often there's a major pause or a type of tone that goes like, "Yeah, I enjoy it." Or after they say they like their job, they then say, "It's alright." No joke, the only few people I have ever heard say they genuinely love their job was a corporate recruiter and a professor who recently hit a tenure track position. We will see how long that enjoyment lasts. Oh, and a software engineer who worked remotely and hardly did any work. And I'm pretty sure he was laid off in the 2024 layoffs when shareholders and executives converged to collectively start firing individuals as record profits, as always, were not enough for them. Anyhow, outside of the economics, when it comes to work, I think there's a clear dilemma here, particularly in specific large economies in countries like the United States, China, and Japan, and Russia, where workers are quite unhappy. On all accounts, suicide is through the roof. Certainly there are crises of meaning here, and a ton of different facets of our lives, but particularly in work itself. The phenomenon of hating your job absolutely extends elsewhere, but large, central, developed economies is where this disdain is often highlighted. I suppose we can start this video with the idea that you really don't like your job, or at the minimum, you have certainly worked a job that you have disliked. Before we start the video, I'll preface with much of this channel is around philosophy and some really in-depth, often convoluted, confusing theory that you might find in a graduate humanities class. I don't want that to be this video. I want this video to be approachable, above all else, being able to grant some genuine concrete understanding to a shared phenomenon most of us experience. This is also likely going to be my most personal video here, and it kinda has to be in my mind. Given how integral work is into our own lives, abstracting away from that experience seems a bit disingenuous to how I can even interpret work. I'm going to highlight much of my experiences here, the things I've dealt with, how I've parsed these things, and how it's led me to think about contemporary cultural theory in which we discuss later in the video. And that's what I want this video to be about, work. I still want to touch on some history of it, where we are today, and in my mind, one of the stronger theories as to why we absolutely hate it. Alright, so here we start. There will be a bit of story time here. This is going to get pretty personal, but I think it's important to touch on this as it will likely mark the basis I am coming from with the rest of the video. I, like so many others, not only in America but around the world, have realistically been working since the age 13 or 14 or so, at least off and on. Also, I don't say that as a badge of honor like some might. I grew up in a pretty blue-collar Midwest family and a father who was a contract painter and a finished carpenter. And let me tell you, this dude worked his ass off. I know there's this intergenerational competition of like, yeah, well, my dad worked so much, he had 3 strokes by the age of 60. A culture that pushes ruthless work hours as a virtue, leading to alcoholism, burnout, suicide, mental health issues, divorce, I don't think is a thing we should aspire to. That said, in hindsight, my mother and father really did love their family, and like many, to their own detriment. My father in particularly worked way too much. But in so many corners of the United States, that is the cultural attitude. This was the baseline where I thought my life needed to go if I was to merely live a life worth living. And this followed me throughout my childhood. Onward, I worked pretty terrible food service jobs, retail, car wash, and even sales. Every single one of these jobs, particularly in retrospect, contains some of the most blatant, ridiculous levels of abuse that today feels quite cartoonish. When I was younger, this was okay in my mind. I thought this is simply what work is. I grew up thinking hating your life was a requisite for enjoying another tiny part of it. This facade started falling apart by the time I was late in high school. It first started when I worked at a hardware store, and the geriatric owner, who was in his 80s at this point, and definitely not cognitively there at all, actually threw a packaged pair of pliers right at me because I asked a question about whether a missing item was in stock in front of a customer. He said something along the lines of that asking this question would hurt the store's reputation. I then pathetically apologized and walked away when a pair of packaged pliers flew right past my head, missing my head by mere inches. According to other employees, this was pretty normalish behavior for him. Another less violent instance was when I worked at an AMC movie theater. During this time, I probably worked just under 40 hours a week. They, of course, did this so they didn't have to pay me a larger wage and benefits. And many of my shifts ended around 1 a.m., where I would then have to wake up and go to school the next day. As per usual, I got tired of this and asked if I could work less, because school and stuff. A manager looked right at me and she said verbatim, "I make your hours, not you." I think you can guess that I quit. But not without feeling an immense amount of guilt, a feeling like I couldn't handle a mere theater job as a high schooler, or particularly that I wasn't man enough to handle it, which certainly made me feel like an utter failure. I then worked at a car wash, and this is where I witnessed, in just a few short months, some of the most abusive workplace culture I have ever seen. The final straw for me was a completely innocent kid who was relentlessly bullied for his weight, his height, and his glasses, from other workers to even managers. One day, amidst being bullied, he just broke down and straight up started crying in front of everybody. I never saw him again after that. To this day, that very situation bothered me probably more than most. Witnessing that type of abuse really did mess with me, and has still stuck with me throughout the years. That moment is what made the facade, the ideological house of cards, finally topple. I was 17 at this point, and I vowed I would never, and I mean never, find myself in those situations again. I would rather be homeless. Nor would I ever bear witness to stuff like that. Mind you, every other terrible thing I witnessed was rationalized as something that was just merely natural, how things simply were, even if I hated it. Like many growing up, I was told abusive, manipulative, dishonest behavior was the very thing I needed to get used to, particularly through the language of being a man. Toughening myself up so that I can provide for some cliche, idealistic nuclear family. These instances and working a few extremely exhausting summers with my father instilled the idea that I really needed to go to college. But I think for many here, we all know college is often a gateway for a completely different type of self-degradation and abuse. A visually different type, but one with the same effect. Something that is deeply psychological, infantilizing, ruthlessly demeaning and full of abuse across every metric. To start off, one of my favorite thinkers who highlights this universal horrid state of work, and someone we haven't covered on this channel, is the theorist and anthropologist David Graeber. I don't think there's one thinker better suited for this very topic. Graeber wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, a theory where he highlights a contemporary cultural presence of, well, completely bullshit jobs. Jobs that are completely and utterly useless, and ones that ironically pay the best, and in the 21st century hold the most prestige. Before we really dive into this, I want to preface this. Many here probably don't work bullshit jobs. Many of you genuinely play an incredibly vital role, and I, for one, am happy you are here. Sanitation workers, food service workers, trade labor, manufacturer line workers, doctors, nurses, what have you. You guys undeniably play such an important role, and I am personally thankful for your existence. But why should important work concern itself with the advent of bullshit jobs? Well, because the entire market evaluation of worth in our current phase of what is often called late-stage capitalism has shifted far away from a traditional material basis of value. For example, we can place a value of doctors and the patients that they heal, a finished job as a laborer, the result of a janitor's cleaning a specific area. The value here is immediate, it's tactile, it exists materially. Let's flip this. What's the measurement of value for a business executive, a middle manager? How about corporate business consultants, a human resource worker? Now, this isn't to say they have no value in those roles within a business proper. I mean, HR as a corporate propaganda machine, meant to subvert discontent in the workplace, is certainly very useful in a business context. But with said value outside of organizations, there's no tactile material measure. Thus, there are roles of nearly zero material impact. And for many in these types of roles, well, they feel like their job is utter and complete bullshit. And very frequently, they are correct in that assessment. But in contemporary capitalism, particularly within the quote-unquote professional business world, there is so much god-awful emphasis on strategists, business intellectuals whose job it is to know things, the real true intellectuals of the world, like this guy, or this guy. How about her? It's easy to pick on executives in retrospect for abusive workplace behavior, using unproved pseudo-medicine for cancer, or defrauding the entire Silicon Valley. But each and every one of these people were worshipped. So why should these people bother me? A vital worker. Well, if it's not completely obvious, and you aren't being directly managed by one, these jobs run everything. Literally everything. The entire basis of organization is controlled by bullshit jobs. There's a reason every professor at a university, a teacher, worker in a hospital, and line manufacturer despise corporate administration. So, in order to get into the bulk of Graeber's theory of work relations in the 21st century, we need to do some basic history. We'll start at the turn of World War II. The United States entered the global stage as the industrial economic powerhouse. But even then, it wasn't always this way. The United States, like many emerging industrial states, was a brutal place to be. From the beginning of the 20th century, in reaction to this brutality, we saw massive worker organization that brought the 5-day work week, robust new protections, and increased wages across the board. One of the wealthiest men on the planet, Henry Ford, consistently spoke about the newer egalitarian work relations that were crucial to Ford's success. He states, "Think how restricted business is in those lands where both men and women still work all day long. They have no time to let the needs of their lives be felt. They have no leisure to buy. They do not expand." Around this time, on the state level, a massive expanded approach to American infrastructure with FDR's New Deal was underway. In a rudimentary summation, with a massive influx of cash flow throughout the economy, workers were able to consume more, Businesses were then able to reap the benefits of said consumption, and amidst this, the state wasn't afraid to step in and regulate on behalf of workers and citizens, regulate against monopoly, child labor, abuse and workplace safety, poisoning water supplies, and detrimental environmental practices, albeit the latter is a bit relative. It probably wasn't good enough anyhow. That said, the United States saw standards of living increase and a workplace that was far more egalitarian, on the basis in how it was organized and even pay. For example, in the 1950s, the average CEO made around 20 times the average worker. Today, the average CEO makes around a whopping 400 times the amount of their workers. The work organization was much more flat compared to today's stark work hierarchy, with today's corporations hosting huge amounts of middle management and executive positions. This period in the mid-20th century, which is often referred to as capitalism's golden age, was roughly deemed Fordist capitalism, or democratic mixed economy. It's important to outline the general history here, as Graeber's first introduction is a section around the economist John Maynard Keynes' prediction in 1930 that by the year 2030, there would be a 15-hour work week, and poverty would be a minor issue. Okay, I'm going to stop this real quick. We're turning the music off here. I want everyone's attention. This is important. Keynes didn't just throw this prediction out of nowhere. In his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, he predicted that through a century, the compounded economic growth would be around 1.5%, which is what he thought would support his very predictions. That's around 4x growth rate. He thought this would likely lead to a 15-hour work week. You know what our current metrics are? They are roughly 2.3%, with an 8x increase in growth, with GDP per capita increasing more than 8 times since 1930. We have completely exceeded his numbers. Yet, not only are we working more than ever, but we have yet to even get close to ending poverty. What does this tell us? Well, the main thing that this tells us is that we are being fleeced. We are being utterly and completely conned. I will point out, consumers through the years wanted to consume more, and consume more they definitely did. But the incredibly lazy rationale of, well, people wanted to consume more than they wanted leisure in some rational justification of an economy bent on harsher work relations is just plain lazy. We've talked a ton on this channel around the concept of desire, from the times of Descartes in the 16th century to Adorno in the 20th century. We've always wanted to understand desire, why and how people want or desire things. At this point in time, I don't think it controversial to say contemporary philosophy has accepted that desire isn't the product of mere rationale. We don't just think something up out of the blue and, well, desire it. We live in human civilization. We are surrounded by others, by systems and institutions, and those very things play a massive role in shaping said desire. Workers in the 20th century didn't just want to consume more because they came to an independent, rational conclusion on their own. They came to that conclusion because they lived in a society full of avid consumers. In the 20th century, however, some academics and philosophers started understanding the various patterns and how this took hold. In the 1947 book Dialectic of Enlightenment, which we've covered on this channel, sociologists and philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer brilliantly highlighted this phenomenon.
Amusement under late capitalism is the prolongation of work. It is sought after as an escape from the mechanized work process, and to recruit strength in order to be able to cope with it again. But at the same time, mechanization has such power over a man's leisure and happiness, and so profoundly determines the manufacture of amusement goods, that his experiences are inevitably after images of the work process itself.
In my mind, this is one of the most powerful explanations in how consumerism takes hold. The origin of mass consumption stemmed from our alienated, rigid state of work. Even in the best conditions and fair pay, we then used consumption to mask this. and in the end became so enamored with the feeling of escape. We necessitated and reinforced the very thing that made us want to escape in the first place. Thus, we created a vicious cycle. So, where are we today? How did we get to our current state of work? Well, it's a bit of a running theme on this channel. Here it is, the coveted neoliberalism. For many new here, I've made so many videos around this topic, so to succinctly sum it up without taking up too much time here, around the late 70s, capitalism quickly changed. Under the visual political apparatuses of administrations like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we saw an ambition to return to austere, laissez-faire capitalism, where we peeled back regulation in the economy and the workplace, we lowered taxes for large corporations, we rolled back public education spending, safety nets for the poor, the disabled, and cracked down on worker organization and unions at large. Essentially, the logic of a more rigidly traditional idea of capitalism, the result saw a workforce that became much more service-orientated, as major manufacturing left the United States in favor of expanding globalized market share in other countries and utilizing cheaper labor. On the austere philosophy and the core capitalist logic of neoliberalism, it's always incredibly vital to point out that an austere version of capitalism isn't really what happened. So what did happen? Neoliberalism didn't really minimize the state at all. Matter of fact, it was responsible in growing it. This thesis was popularized under David Harvey's A Brief History of Neoliberalism. He highlights this irony here.
Neoliberalization has meant, in short, the financialization of everything. But this has not meant the withdrawal of the state from the economy. On the contrary, the state has been reconfigured to serve the interests of financial capital, and its role has expanded in ways that are often opaque but profoundly influential.
Let's think about the bailouts of the financial sector in 2008, where banks were failing. Under the technical philosophy of neoliberalism, a business or industry failing is a mere market correction, and the market would then solve the dilemma on its own. That's not what happened. Matter of fact, that has never happened, nor could it ever. So what did? Well, the federal government used trillions of dollars in taxpayers' money and simply gave it to the failing banks. They did this in 2020 during COVID in the airline industry when it nearly fell apart. The US government, post-neoliberalism, has given millions in subsidies, taxpayer money, to help alleviate financial losses in the fossil fuel industry as well. And in today's world, this is a bit more recent than the origins of neoliberalism. The large institutions, such as banks, have been protected by a central bank that essentially just throws money to them when things get rough. So the implication here is that when corporations are making more money and getting rich, then it's capitalism as usual. They then get to privatize their gains. But if they lose money, they then socialize the losses. 50 years before this, the US government wouldn't have bailed out these industries. If they were vital for a society to be able to function normally, they would just purchase it and put it under public control. Because it's our money. If market functions are universal, we technically purchase them if we had to bail them out, right? They did this with railroads. They did this with public utilities like water treatment and power grids. Today in neoliberalism, if a vital private piece of infrastructure fails, we make sure the existing executives and owners maintain their wealth on the behest of taxpayers. Thus, neoliberalism isn't the subtraction of the state, it's a remolding of it where the role of government isn't meant to work on the behalf of the public, such as workers or common citizens, but businesses and capitalists. And we've had about 40 strong years of this so far. If we were speaking about the movement of different forms of capitalism, I think it wise to introduce a newer idea that I find pretty compelling. That's the idea that neoliberalism was the last true push of capitalism. We've progressed into what we have now, which is techno-feudalism. According to the economist Yanis Varoufakis, while there is enough here to necessitate another video, if you're interested in that in particular, I'll point you to Philosophize This Is podcast on that very topic. But for the video, to sum up the techno-feudalistic thesis, our current economic system and largest players like Google, Uber, Amazon didn't really make or produce anything other than a platform or an algorithm that they rent out to other sellers, entrepreneurs, and even consumers. Thus, our economy relies on rent as its core mechanism. From literally renting rather than owning necessary goods, to creating a rent-based economic framework we see with Amazon, Uber, etc. Giannis's point is much more economic and structural, but I want to emphasize Graeber's point here of the cultural form of work being much more feudalistic in nature from the get-go. Our new structural landscape of late-stage capitalism, or techno-feudalism, whatever you want to call it, reinforces the heavy quasi-spiritual phenomenon embedded in the form of corporate worship. In my mind, and in a large part Graeber's, there has always been massive problems with the concept of work and wage labor being the driver of human organization. This has been at the forefront of conversation for hundreds of years since the advent of the Enlightenment. That said, neoliberalism was one of the largest accelerators and markers of the detrimental relationship we have with work today. And it's impossible to talk about work without understanding the modern structures that inform how we work. Alright, so in 2024, we established a lot of us hate our jobs, and we established much of the socioeconomic history that led to it. Well, what are the various ways that this manifests in the 21st century? Graeber has an outline here that I quite like. Number 1, flunkies. People who merely make superiors feel important. Assistants, door greeters, attendants. He claims that there's a second one. Number 2, goons. People whose job it is to lie on behalf of their employers. Corporate lawyers, public relations people, HR, and lobbyists. Number 3, duct tapers. People whose job it is to merely fix problems that shouldn't be there. Certain trade workers whose entire business hinges upon its ability to repair existing work. This is actually quite common in some trade labor, like the electrical field. We can see this in some programmer roles as well, dealing with a phenomenon called technical debt. Think about the July 2024 CrowdStrike IT failure that quite literally shut down the world for about a day. CrowdStrike broke IT infrastructure that was already pretty antiquated, like Windows machines and servers in the airline industry that refused to migrate over to more modern, stable systems. Number 4, box tickers, whose role is centered upon appearing to do something useful. Corporate compliance, internal marketing, HR also fits into this, as well as the last category, which is number 5. Taskmasters. Peoples whose job it is to create needless extra work to just justify their positions. Business strategists, middle management, and consultants. These jobs are seen as the important roles that very capable, talented, educated people take, where corporations spend insane amounts of money carefully vetting for a job. A special process they call talent acquisition, for a role a fucking middle schooler could likely do in little time. Essentially a bullshit job with a lot of prestige behind it. I don't know about you all, but do you guys love the corporate recruiting language of talent acquisition or talent discovery? While not only being the most useless descriptor holding a lot of cynical, arrogant, and classist weight, but a grossly ableist and, dare I say, eugenicist subtext to it. The messaging of only the talented specialists of the world are capable of employment here. Yet, these jobs exist on top of necessary laborious work that quite literally holds society together. Trade labor, sanitation, food service, often being told by individuals in these positions that they do not deserve a comfortable, livable wage. It also doesn't help that other, often blue-collar workers alongside them advocate against them and themselves. But this is the power of ideology. To serve against the interest of you and your neighbor for the betterment of ownership above you. Now, there's often a very Americanized ideological narrative around jobs that have no merit. The traditional visual was government bureaucratic jobs, represented the most useless inefficiencies of society. Thus, the private sector jumps in and will fix things, given the profit motive incentivizes. Now, I will preface, bureaucracy in the public sector absolutely exists, and antiquated systems whose sole purpose is to justify itself is a reality in the public sector. Yet it's sort of tied to the overarching harmful idea of work above all else that we are speaking about here, which is something the private sector embodies even more. The problem with government bureaucracy being the sole narrative is that this doesn't really line up with history. There's two main things going on. Government agencies in the US are much more lean than the average corporation, minus things like the Pentagon, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the military at large. Essentially things that are set up to kill people and protect corporate interests. This is important because the stereotype of government bloat is usually labeled around welfare systems, public services that help average citizens, or annoying licensing processes, like the DMV. The large agencies like the military are pretty much at this point wings of the private sector, spearheaded by Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, etc., as that's where the bulk of taxpayer money goes to. Private weapons manufacturing. We will get to this in point 2. That said, government services are typically forced to do more with less, and that has actually always been the case in American history. This isn't a new phenomenon. The idea of social services being bloated, overfunded, is a complete and utter ahistorical fabrication of reality. That has quite literally never been the case in American history. What has been the case is a military that purchases $8,000 coffee makers and $37 screws in 1986, mind you. Yes, 1986. The relationship with bloat, bureaucracy, is primarily seen with the convergence of social services or state functions colliding with the private sector. Trillion-dollar military budgets, absurdly expensive pharmaceuticals, and private healthcare costs are driven up by primarily price-fixing profiteers and government entities happy to subsidize it. You know what isn't bloated? Teacher salaries, public defendant salaries, and social worker pay. Graeber states,
"The standard argument for privatization is that the private sector is inherently more efficient than the public sector. This argument is rooted in a particular understanding of bureaucracy as inherently wasteful and incompetent. However, the reality is often quite different. When functions are privatized, the result is often not a decrease in bureaucracy, but rather an increase in it. The private sector frequently introduces its own complex layers of administrative overhead, with less transparency and accountability. Instead of reducing bureaucratic costs, privatization often merely shifts them to less visible, more opaque forms of management. This shift can result in greater overall expenses for the state, as the cost of managing and monitoring private contracts can be substantial."
You know, the traditional form of white-collar work follows a hierarchical organization where patriarchs or matriarchs sit at each department with an aristocratic, anti-democratic control. In the 21st century, the form of this dynamic has been supplanted. Kind of. It's certainly different, and dare I say, worse. When managing workers, the whole idea is control and power. Power is much more effective as an implicit tool rather than explicit. The patriarchal, industrialized notion of management is far too apparent. Isn't it much more effective to give people the appearance of agency in the workplace? Things like beanbag chairs, recreational rooms, non-cubicled open space, an office that is a home away from home. Management who adhere to fine-tuned HR language and management practices. The result here is pure manipulation, and one that isn't really any less hierarchical nor overtly authoritarian. Graeber states,
"The fun corporate culture is a classic example of how companies can manipulate employees into a sense of belonging and purpose while exploiting them. By fostering an atmosphere where work is presented as a game, or where there are constant perks and social events, companies obscure the underlying fact that the labor being demanded is often meaningless, and the power structures remain unchanged. This kind of corporate environment is not necessarily about improving the actual working conditions, but rather about maintaining control and ensuring compliance by making employees feel valued in a superficial way.
One area of work culture that is ironically becoming more powerful is its religious and spiritual form. Traditional religion, the church, has been in decline for decades now. Yet, since the mid-20th century, theorists have noticed that the human capacity for worship has moved more than it has disappeared. There's been a twofold shift here. The church has become a corporation, and the corporation has become a church. We will start first with the latter dynamic. With the economic boom we spoke about earlier in the video, we moved from a cultural logic of stark industrial, material efficiency to postmodern idealistic aesthetics. And in my mind, this is a more powerful form. With the creation of mass media, advertising, and narrative started taking hold as the product itself. People weren't purchasing just a product or a service, but an ideal, an identity, an ideology. Sports cars, guns, tobacco, all signs and symbols that people would cling to, and corporations would create lifelong consumers. Guy Debord, the French philosopher and author of The Society of the Spectacle, highlighted this phenomenon quite visually. He coined this newer consumer worship ideology as the spectacle.
The spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. The spectacle is the moment when the commodity has achieved the final stage of its autonomy. It becomes an object of worship. The spectacle is the self-portrait of the dominant economic order, and it is a religious form that serves as the instrument of its domination. This religion of the commodity establishes itself as the ultimate expression of the alienation of human beings.
Writing this in the late 60s, is this not even more relevant in the 21st century? And it's not just consumption, but the way in which we conduct work, how workplace culture develops. The office is a church, where workers, managers, and droves sit amidst the central mesh of worship itself. Most of your presence in an office isn't really to do much of anything, particularly in the 21st century where so much office work can be done on a computer anywhere. Your role in an office is to reinforce the pseudo-religious hierarchy that is taking place. I know many here have experienced a corporate orientation when starting a job. Tell me that isn't anything but the most church-like thing you've ever experienced, all while being insultingly infantilizing. But that's your job. That's the point. In many ways, your job is best described as to inherently be beneath somebody. That's the whole ordeal. When Graeber himself talks or cites contemporary psychology on the mental harm done to individuals in the workplace, it's not just the feeling of worthlessness, your job not mattering, but that your organizational worth is directly tied to how well you can be beneath somebody. How do you best maintain the orchestration of corporate organization? We've seen profit-seeking organizations take on a religious form throughout history, or at least seen huge cults of personality, but we've never seen it to this extent today with modern media, with branding, organizational mantras. It's a cult of personality, but by way of quasi-religious brand apparatuses, by way of systems and organization rather than any one individual. Take Google, Apple, other large Silicon Valley organizations. It's much more about the grand image of their organization, the spectacle, than any person or even cohesive ideology proper. Well, except for money. But corporate communications cannot talk about that. It's all about innovation, corporate responsibility, and the like. A diversion. We see the start of this in the 20th century, forging a completely hyper-image-based advertising apparatus from the likes of Coca-Cola. And we're doing the same with inter-organizational practice today. Workers forced to attend leadership seminars, attend bullshit meetings, all while integrating yourself into the fundamental corporate religion you're embedded in. But here's the real kicker. The primary enforcement of said culture is done by way of middle management. And there's no greater bullshit role than management. And many managers are totally aware of their obsolescence. It's not like these people aren't human. Understanding that what you do benefits nobody is certainly an uncomfortable thing to contend with. One, you still have to pretend that it is. You have to put on a mask every single day. This is probably one of the more difficult parts. going to conferences or meetings with others who are pretending, or worse, people who genuinely convince themselves with the power of overinflated egos. Managers, in many ways, while picturesque enforcers, are still massive victims of this scheme. Managers still have to fire or lay off people completely against their will. There's a newer phenomenon amidst contemporary corporate practice of just flat out laying individuals off once they reach a certain age, usually close-ish to retirement. Despite that being clearly illegal, we see corporations laying individuals off after a large uptick in business cools off, rather than relocating to specific needed areas. This practice has happened in the past, but it's becoming more standardized throughout. Middle management is not immune to this, and even individuals up the corporate hierarchy are target of the corporate short-sighted pursuit of quick profits. A past video on Foucault's Discipline and Punish went into detail around the application of power being executed by the very people punished. There is an orchestra of fear and shame that permeates throughout the workforce here, and you don't need to be completely gung-ho executors. You just need people who have enough to lose in order to move the religious cycle forward. This section is going to be quite heavy on speculation. We don't know what the future will bring, but we can ask the right questions. Can we not only do better, but will we do better? I actually think the answer is yes. Matter of fact, in my heart, I hold a fair bit of optimism. For a lot of things in the future, actually, but very much so on how we conduct work relations. Critical theory and philosophy often brings hidden pieces of our existence to the surface. The result of this often leads to feelings of depressive malaise, a loss of hope, adding layers of newfound alienation to our existence. But in another sense, these present new pathways to which we gain insight, new critique and focus on how we improve. I find humans to be an inherently progressive species embedded in ideological frameworks whose goal it is to keep things the same, for obvious reasons. But we're resistant to this. We always have been, and we always will be. So how do we solve this? I personally have no definitive answers, clear-cut pathways that will facilitate the end of this phase of corporate feudalism. But I think there's some really clear ideas here. The first one is unionization, worker organization. Matter of fact, I think this may be the most pivotal thing we can do, but perhaps not in the exact ways we think. Unionization is often presented and even practiced as a band-aid to work. Increased wages, better work conditions, better hours, more time off. All these things are great, but I don't think that's where unionization is the strongest, nor where unions have the most capability in truly changing how we approach work for the betterment of society. And primarily in the US, we've yet to fully reharness this strength like we saw in the 20th century. That's unions' ability to politically mobilize, to be a genuine force, to mobilize a mass of workers to exercise genuine political power. You cannot effectively organize or exercise democracy in the workplace, or even in state functions, without an actual, real organization. You are absolutely nothing but a blip all by yourself, even if your government or workplace grants you channels for democratic input. Because at the end of the day, they maintain the bulk of the power. We're falsely taught in school within the tradition of liberal democracy, basic civics, such as voting or speech, is an equal, emphasis on equal here, basis of negotiation. That couldn't be further from the truth. In order for speech or negotiation to hold any semblance of legitimacy, you must be on at least an equal plane of power relations. If it's anything less, it's a pacification technique to grant the appearance of something. And on your own, agency is something you will never possess. You can only do that by banding together. Solutions to the problems we've described throughout the video only exist when you hit them where it hurts. This is why striking is so incredibly effective, and it has been for centuries. Perhaps there are some deeper points here, that we can never approach the betterment of work relations outside the sphere of social and political bounds. Here's the good news though. Unionization and union favorability is soaring. Just in August of 2022, the outlook on unionization was the most favorable it has been since 1965. We've seen massive union pushes within extremely predatory institutions such as Amazon and Starbucks, which have both seen massive gains in just the past few years. And just within the month of writing this script, the first ever large gaming studio, Bethesda Game Studios, just voted to unionize. But it's not just the quantity of unionization, but how workers are unionizing, and the ambition of these unions themselves. For the past 30 years, we have seen large unions that have become what many would describe as, at best, content to be on the defensive, and at worst, business wings of a specific industry that they represent, particularly with organizations such as UAW. And yet, that's changing fast, ironically within the UAW themselves. Visualized with Shawn Fain, who has advocated for a much more militant approach to negotiation, which resulted in one of the largest auto worker strikes in history. The new UAW has been much more vocal about its stances on policy at large around healthcare, money and politics, and taxing the rich. All things exactly what unions should be doing. I brought up organization and unionization as a political force because as it stands, I think it may be the only thing that allows us to exercise genuine power by way of a general strike. Withholding purchasing, consumption, our labor, and every facet of society for even a few days would absolutely crush any institution, particularly on a national scale. It's just that creating the networks that would facilitate a successful general strike is very, very difficult. Yet, we have had localized general strikes a few times in the United States. In 1919, Seattle had around a week-long general strike for better work conditions for dock workers. It was also highly organized, with neighborhoods coming together to facilitate necessary services for individuals, things such as food, water, and core essentials. And one of the funniest historical tidbits I found when reading about the Seattle general strike is that the newspapers were nationally running stories saying that Bolsheviks and communists took over Seattle. 100 years later, we're still doing the same thing today. Of course, the struggle of being able to actually organize collectively is very difficult, and the necessary aid in grassroots welfare networks needed to sustain something like this is a monumental task. It's just that worker organization and unions have been the only historical framework to facilitate something at this scale. At the end of the day, I don't think our relationship with work is sustainable. It's not something that will be solved by merely getting paid more either. Neither the ability to consume more, and at an even lower bar, merely able to just survive. I think it necessary to internalize that mass consumerism is and has always been a mask to shield us from our own alienated existence while making the richest in society richer. I absolutely think there is hope, though. I've spoken on this channel quite extensively, my view on the century-long debates around whether history can be viewed as something innately progressive. I lean more towards the idea that it is. I find that in most people, there tends to be more good than bad, and history moves in that direction alongside with that. I also find that there is an endless sociological desire for something better. Aside from our inherent human state of being good or bad, what is undeniable is that more people have dispositions of wanting more of that good. And that's pretty powerful. Whether that good is to understand something to its finest minutiae, to expand the horizon on how we approach human sentience, care for others. In this light, despair is so incredibly lazy, and luckily, the best parts of us are not. I think we are very capable of achieving a world where nobody has to work mindless 48-hour work weeks of bullshit, needless jobs. It's up to us, though, whether we organize our workforce, whether we decide that all people are deserving of something better, no matter your race, your sex, your gender, sexuality, creeds. The world truly is and has always been made from us. Thank you all so much for watching and making it to the end. This is quite the long one, so if you are still with me, I have a huge request. I couldn't make any of these videos without the support of the people over on Patreon or the YouTube member section. You can find ad-free videos on there, some exclusive content, voting for future videos, and more. Please do consider pledging with the link below. As for my patrons themselves, thanks so much, and for the ones who go above and beyond, Cedric Watman, Kevin Hoop, Jay Roberts, Britton Jensen, and Kate, thank you all so much for going above and beyond. Truly. Hope to see you all in the next.